of tremendous significance to Muslims who strive to fulfill this obligation at least once in their lifetime. It consists of devotional practices and rituals and is followed by a visit to God's messenger, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in Medina, the illuminated city. The main annual pilgrimage is called the Hajj, which is performed at the same time every year according to the lunar calendar. And the lesser pilgrimage is performed around the year. One of the most visible, striking aspects of the pilgrimage is that all male pilgrims don the same white clothing, so you cannot distinguish the rich person from the poor and the king from the servant. All appear equal before God. The pilgrimage is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, and these 5 pillars support the building of Islam. Without them, the building is in ruin. Performing the pilgrimage has excellent merit in the Islamic tradition. The Quran says, "And proclaim to mankind the Hajj. They will come to you on foot and on every lean camel, coming from every deep ravine. And every year, millions of Muslims travel from every part of the world, responding to the call of God and say, 'Here I am at thy service, O God, here I am.'" And this is part of the invocation recited by the pilgrims. The Hadith literature further elaborates on the merit of the pilgrimage by stating that the reward of an accepted pilgrimage is nothing but paradise. And whoever performs Hajj and does not commit any obscenity or transgression will return free from sins as if he was on the day his mother gave birth to him. It is a means of purification from sin and attaining the mercy and forgiveness of God. The Prophet Abraham, who is the great ancestor of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his son Ishmael, played a significant role in building the sacred house of God. We have in the Islamic tradition, and the Quran says that Abraham raised the foundation of the house with Ishmael, both praying, "Our Lord, accept this from us. You are indeed all-hearing, all-knowing." And the Prophet Abraham is also significant in the sacrifice of an animal to mark the completion of Hajj. The practice of sacrificing an animal commemorates the sacrifice of Abraham, who was prepared to sacrifice his son Ishmael for the sake of God. The story is narrated in the Quran that Abraham said to his son, "O my son, I have seen in a dream that I am slaughtering you. So look, what do you think?" And his son, being the obedient son that he was, he said, "O my father, do that which you're commanded. God willing, you shall find me patient." Then when they had both submitted themselves to the will of God, and he had laid him prostrate on his forehead, we called out to him, "O Abraham, you have fulfilled the vision. Verily, thus do we reward those who perform good deeds. Verily, that indeed was a manifest trial, and we ransomed him with a great sacrifice, and we left for him favorable mention among later generations. Salamun, peace be upon Abraham. Thus indeed do we reward the muhsineen, the good doers. Verily, he was one of our believing slaves." As we can see from the Quranic verses, the great mention of Abraham and his readiness to sacrifice his son for the sake of God. His devotion and purity of intention is an inspiration for Muslims. Having inner connection with God is an important spiritual dimension. The pilgrim should devote his or her attention exclusively to God, and his heart turn tranquil with the remembrance of God and the veneration of the holy rites and rituals of the pilgrimage. The pilgrim should be aware that he is on a journey to God, which is a journey unlike any other worldly voyage. He should be aware that he is traveling towards the King of Kings, along with a host of visitors who have been summoned to the house of God and have answered his call. So how does the pilgrimage relate to the purpose of life for the Muslim? Well, the pilgrimage and indeed all acts of worship prepare the Muslim for knowing God in this life and the ultimate meeting with God in the hereafter. The Muslim is consistently reminded that life itself is a journey to God and a means of drawing close to Him. The Quran mentions that the life of the world is a fleeting enjoyment. It is a hereafter, which is the abode of permanence. And a hadith states, be in the world as if you were a stranger or a traveler. The destination is God, and the best traveling provision is taqwa, which is God consciousness, piety, righteousness, which a Muslim strives for in all aspects of his or her daily life. And this includes good interactions with family members, neighbours, and society at large in emulation of the good character and teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. For example, regards kind treatment towards the neighbour. The Prophet, peace be upon him, said, Gabriel emphasized upon me kind treatment towards the neighbour so much that I thought as if he would confer upon him the right of inheritance. And with that, I will end. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Safia, for introducing the roots, really, of pilgrimage, at least across the Abrahamic tradition there with Ibrahim. And I love that phrase, be in the world as if you were a stranger, from the Hadith. And I think that could have resonances across different faith traditions. So you've introduced for us pilgrimage and exile in the interfaith context. And our next speaker will also speak to this subject. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome a colleague of mine and my predecessor in my current role, the Right Reverend Martin Gorick, Bishop Martin, who is Bishop of Dudley in the Diocese of Worcester. Martin studied theology at Cambridge and then became a curate, I think a curate, and certainly worked in the Diocese of Birmingham before also being chaplain to the Bishop of Oxford. So he served in the Diocese of Oxford before, and then was vicar of the Civic Church in Stratford-on-Avon, and interestingly was chaplain to the Royal Shakespeare Company. So we look forward to a dramatic presentation. Before his present role, Martin was my predecessor, Archdeacon of Oxford, where he also served as the diocesan interfaith advisor. And I know that he remains passionate about interfaith relations. He's able to put that into practicing his current role, where he speaks on various issues affecting human flourishing, from the environment to bioethics, and looking to share his own faith, his Christian gospel, whether it's in inner urban, rural, or in his present role, also in the civic communities. So Martin, you bring a lot of practice, experience, and academic background to this, and we look forward to you speaking now on pilgrimage from a Christian perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for that very kind invitation and introduction. Well, it's a joy to be with all of you this evening. I'm delighted to be a patron of the Oxford Interfaith Forum and very happy to join with fellow travellers and pilgrims through life this evening from different countries and different faith backgrounds. Shalom, salam, peace be with you. I speak tonight from a personal perspective as a human being and as a Christian, a person of faith. My surname is unusual in England, Gorick, and all Goricks in England are descended from one man, Jacques Gorick, who escaped religious wars in France to find a new life in England over 300 years ago. Was he a pilgrim or a refugee? Probably both. He ended up in the East End of London and attended the French church that the refugees built there. That building went on to become a synagogue as Jewish refugees began to replace the French refugees. And today that building is still there in London's East End, having now become the famous Brick Lane Mosque, as migrants from Bangladesh have sought and found a religious home in London's East End. Everyone in England is descended from a migrant of one kind or another. For many of us, pilgrimage is in our blood. Well, today the word pilgrimage is used in many different ways. For example, it's used in secular contexts. I made a kind of pilgrimage with my son some years ago to Anfield to see Liverpool play football. We're both avid supporters, and I was born there, and it's great to go back to that cathedral of football, Anfield Road. I was vicar of Stratford-on-Avon at the time, as Jonathan has mentioned. William Shakespeare was buried in my church there. And every year I would welcome thousands, tens of thousands sometimes, of secular pilgrims to visit his grave, from Dame Judi Dench to coachloads of Russians, Chinese, and pretty well every nation on earth. They came seeking Shakespeare, which was great, and I hoped as the priest they would leave having found something of God as well. So there are secular pilgrimages in life, but for people of faith, pilgrimage means either a journey to a holy place, and we've just heard described the Hajj in Islam. A pilgrimage to a holy place is found in pretty well every major faith on earth of one kind or another. Also, it's used in a more figurative way to describe our human journey through life. And I'd like to explore both of those in my time with you tonight. The word pilgrim comes from the Latin peregrinus, meaning foreigner or stranger. It gained its distinctive religious use in Europe, I gather, in the late 1200s, describing a journey, usually a long and arduous one, that a Christian, in terms of Christian use of that word in Europe, that a Christian would make to a holy place. They could travel alone or with others, and could be seeking forgiveness, a special blessing from God, or a miracle of healing, fertility, or whatever. In England, the journey might just be to the shrine of a saint, like St. Thomas of Canterbury, the most famous shrine in England in the Middle Ages. Or it might be further afield to the center of the Western Church in Rome and to the seat of the Pope, the burial place of St. Peter and St. Paul. But the ultimate pilgrimage for a Christian has always been to the land of Jesus himself and the places associated with his life, especially to Jerusalem, the holy city. I was privileged to make a pilgrimage myself to the Holy Land some years ago and to lead a group of pilgrims from Stratford. And I will certainly never forget it. I hope I get to go again at some point. It's a place sacred, of course, to Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. Simply to spend time in that land and in that city was special enough. But to be in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, to reach inside the star on the floor in a particular chapel and touch the rock of Calvary on which Jesus was crucified, was to stand in a long line of pilgrims, of people from every part of the world, and also of my ancestors in faith, going back so many centuries. Then I queued over several days to find a chance to get into the tiny chapel built over the supposed site of Jesus' burial and resurrection within that same church complex. In the end, I did get in for a precious few seconds only. It's so small, only one person can go in at a time. And for that one short moment, I was all alone in that holiest of holy places for a Christian. And to my surprise, God spoke to me there. I don't often share it, but I will share it with you tonight. The words that I heard in my mind were clear. He is not here. He is risen. They're words found in our scriptures, in fact, spoken by an angel to the women who'd gone to bring spices to the tomb just before dawn on that first Easter morning. The women in the story were called to journey on, not to a holy place, but out into the world where Jesus would meet them in the people and places of everyday life. The end of any pilgrimage journey, you might say, is to return into the world, but to see it with fresh eyes. And certainly that's how I left that holy place that morning. He is not here. He is risen. Join him in the world outside. Well, our human journey through life is sometimes called a pilgrimage as well. And our scriptures are filled with stories of God-inspired journeys through life, whether the journeys of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so many others in the Hebrew Bible, or what we call the Old Testament, or the journeys of Jesus himself, a Jew on pilgrimage, going to festivals in Jerusalem. And so many of our stories and his sayings arise from those occasions. God-inspired journeys through life, though, are about lives lived in obedience to God, not simply journeys to a holy site. The call of Abraham, for example, when God says, "Go from your country and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that," and this is important, "you will be a blessing." The calling to Abraham was to leave all that was familiar and to travel into the unknown. Abraham and his family would certainly be blessed, as most pilgrims hope they will be. But it was for a reason, in order that through him all the families of the earth will be blessed as well. It was a blessing in order to become a blessing. A fantastic calling not only to Abraham, but to the people of God of every generation. It sums up God's promise, I think, to all who follow him. You will find blessing, but it will not be easy. This call is not just for you, but that God might bless others through you. Well, as a priest and now as a bishop, I've had to move many times, and that's been challenging as my family and I have to leave home and leave friends behind whenever I am called on and we decide it is time to pack up our things and to travel on in faith, as Abraham and so many others have. Many of you will have had to move or felt called to move, and that can be painful as well as fulfilling. In our scriptures, St. Paul says, "Here we have no abiding city," saying elsewhere that heaven is our homeland as Christians, and sometimes in this world, the people of God can feel far from home. Our Muslim speaker in the Psalms series, Yomna Helmni, last week, called herself a resident alien, living a life that challenges and is challenged by society around her. I think St. Paul would recognize that. There is a Christian hymn that reminds me of this. It's for children and families, but I love it. One verse goes, "Don't get too set in your ways," the Lord said. "Each step is only a phase," the Lord said. "I'll go before you and I shall be a sign to guide your traveling, wandering race. You're the people of God." So every day we're on our way. We're a traveling, wandering race called the people of God. It's a lovely song. But then most human beings are searching, always looking for something more. They may look to relationships, to drugs, to status, or possessions for fulfillment. Any night of the week, you can turn on the TV and see some of this searching in action, whether it's in Love Island or whatever show you happen to want to watch. But as the Irish rock band U2 put it in their great song, I still haven't found what I'm looking for. I still haven't found what I'm looking for. I would say, as a person of faith, that God alone can satisfy that desire deep within every person. As the North African theologian and Bishop Augustine put it in a well-known prayer, "O God, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless till they find their rest in you." The search for meaning is a universal human experience. Seeking to travel with God and pilgrimage to holy places can be found in every major faith. But finally and briefly, as a Christian, I would want to witness to something else beyond those universal religious experiences. Not our journey towards God, but God's own pilgrimage to find us. For me, as a Christian, at the heart of all things is a God who is so filled with life and love that he reaches out to create the universe in which we live. A God who then came to share our life in Jesus, that we might share his life forever in heaven. A God who doesn't wait for us to be good enough to be worthy of him, but comes to meet us in Jesus, to bring us home. As a Christian, I believe in one God, but also speak of the Trinity, of movement and relationship within God, a divine pilgrimage or dance that we are invited to join in. God beyond me, God beside me, God within me, the companion as well as the goal of my pilgrimage. So thank you for listening and for being part of my faith journey today.
Thank you very much, Bishop Martin, for a very rich journey into the subject of pilgrimage, both our own pilgrimage to God, but also God's to us, and his ending up with that thought that he is a companion with us on our journey. Thank you very much. I'm sure there'll be some good questions to come for both Safia and for Martin, but also hopefully coming for our third speaker, speaking from the Jewish tradition, the Jewish perspective, is Dr. Mia Spiro. Maya is actually our second Glasgow link. She's though not born and bred, I think, but lecturer in Jewish studies at the University of Glasgow, particularly in cultural studies. She completed her PhD in English at York University, Toronto, specializing in modern literature, but with a graduate diploma in Jewish studies and advanced Hebrew. She has a multidisciplinary work with the relationship particularly between ethics and cultural production through the lens of aesthetic modernism, Jewish history, and the impact of the Holocaust. And she's the author of work on anti-Nazi modernism, the challenges of resistance in 1930s fiction, and has produced papers on Jewish representation in the interwar period. So there's a lot about exile, I think, in all that to start with. But before coming to the University of Glasgow, she was a visiting scholar at the Crown Family Centre for Jewish Studies in Northwestern University in Illinois. She's been an editor and a research consultant at the Azrieli Foundation series of Canadian Holocaust survivor memoirs, and also as a freelance writer in Jerusalem. That's just a little bit of your broad portfolio of experience and research interest, Maya. So we very much look forward to what you have to say from a Jewish perspective.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And some of the, and thank you also to the speakers who came before me, Safia and Reverend Gorick, who gave such inspiring talks, and thank you for Oxford Interfaith Forum for inviting me. And part of what I'm talking about today, which has to do with Jewish exile and Jewish border crossing, formulates some of my current research into Jewish migration, and especially in the haunting of haunted characters that appear in a lot of cultural productions, harkening back to the past. They're what I call border crossing figures. And some of the questions that arise from my own research have to do with ideas about exile and the reality of Jewish migration. So the ideal and the real. So the idea of exile and return in Judaism as a theological concept, as a metaphoric concept, sometimes comes into conflict with the socio-political realities of Jewish migration. Of course, it would be an understatement to point out that Jewish exile as a phenomenon goes far beyond the physical displacement of Jewish individuals. There's an element, after all, that can be measured and tracked and observed by social and political scientists when you think about migration. But the mythic and metaphysical quality of Jewish exile as a theological and philosophical and symbolic condition has resonant meanings within Jewish as well as Christian theology. So what I want to open up with today is really some questions about how much this idea of exile and return in Judaism may add to, but also obscure, the actual facts around geographic and temporal movements of Jewish individuals in the modern world, and to ask, what is gained and what is lost in these metaphoric meanings. In his Nobel Prize speech entitled "The Condition We Call Exile," the poet Joseph Brodsky contrasts migration as a specific geographic and temporal phenomena to what he calls the condition of exile, which he deems as, and I'm quoting here, a psychological, philosophical, and existential, even metaphysical condition that defines this experience of migration as displacement, loss, and homelessness. In other words, migration as the movement of people across borders is very different than the experience of that migration and the effect it has on individuals. And when considering Jewish migration, the added mythical element that accompanies both that physical phenomenon of migration and its metaphoric uses affects common perceptions of the Jew as forever wandering or as a foreigner. Only recently has scholarship on Jewish migration history challenged these commonplace assumptions about Jewish exile to illuminate the multiple ways the mythic understandings of Jewish exile have affected the ways that Jews and Jewish migration history is perceived. The way the story of the Jews is understood is often as one of a series of flights from persecution. The symbolic nature of the exile redemption dyad model of Jewish history, however, may also obscure the facts and the complexities of those very same Jewish demographic movements and the multiple reasons behind those passages. So I'm going to start with the idea of Jewish exile and move into some of the reality and some questions to consider when we think about looking at both of them side by side. In the historical and cultural imagination of the West, the very concept of diaspora is linked with ideas of Jewish wandering as an existential state. There's a tendency to see the Jewish people as a people on the move, fleeing from Palestine in the Roman era in 100 CE, along the Mediterranean littorals, the Iberian Peninsula, across Europe and East Africa throughout the next centuries. Rabbinic Judaism too linked galut, exile, to divine punishment. From the expulsions of the Garden of Eden, the wandering of Cain, displacement has often been a curse in Judaism, very often for not keeping the laws or not being devout enough. In Deuteronomy, for example, Jews are warned that displacement will follow if, quote, thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God. And that's in chapter 28, verse 15. From an outsider's perspective, images such as the wandering Jews date back to the 13th century, and they were revived in the 16th, and became popular but also very harmful images as a determining and identifying character of Jewish displacement as punishment for denying Christ, based on the Christian myth of Ahasuerus, a Jew who taunted Jesus on his way to the crucifixion and was thereby cursed to wander the earth. But exile has also for centuries taken on metaphysical and existential meanings that are more symbolic in nature. The expulsion from Eden can take on an interpretive resonance towards understanding exile as a universal condition, the alienation of man from nature, man from man, man from God. Medieval mysticism, and more specifically the Kabbalah of Rabbi Isaac Luria, for example, was built on a profound idea of exile, that to bring about creation, God had to withdraw from the world to create an empty space, to create something from nothing. Lurianic Kabbalists called this tzimtzum, the withdrawal of the Godhead. And in this empty region, God sent a line of light to make the Sefirot, the emanations. Creation has its basis in a divine catastrophe where that light could not be contained within the borders of the vessels. And there was a concept of the Vestals, a catastrophe that started the universe when the divine light flowed into those vessels and some of the lower ones broke. The shards of divine light separated and ascended upwards, and this is called the breaking of the vessel, and it's central to the divine crisis that propels the purpose of man. Because those shards and remnants introduced chaos into the world in the concept of Lurianic Kabbalah, everything that follows the breaking is an attempt to correct that initial catastrophe, to overcome the dualism between divine light and Sefirot and the lower created world. And this repeats in opportunities that are lost. Adam's attempt to overcome dualism in the Garden of Eden, but he chooses evil and the breaking of the vessels. Israel's given the Torah in Sinai, but they worship the calf and choose evil. And this repeats with the temple and people's consideration of one another and so on. Tikkun is the mending of the broken vessels. And this, in this concept, is the purpose of man's existence. It's not a personal salvation of the soul, but a redemption and return as salvation of the world. Tikkun is the ultimate redemption and harmony of the universe that can bring the Messiah. And it's done through ethical behavior and unselfish pursuit of perfection to bring about the messianic age of return. But the actual evidence of Jews on the move has to be taken into consideration in the larger context of world migrations. So I'm going to get into reality now. In reality, Jews were only one part of the world's major migrations in the 19th century. They were but one of historical diasporas of the first millennium, which included the Armenian and Chinese diasporas. The great imperial dynasties that controlled much of the global economies from the 15th to the 18th centuries required human resources to keep those resources flowing, to serve as a growing middle class. Major migration systems also centered across the Atlantic in the Afro-Atlantic slave and labor system, which began in the 1440s and only ended in the 1870s. The end of the 19th and early 20th centuries also saw indentured labor and contract labor migration that imperial authorities imposed on Asian societies. This was aside from the way war and climate disasters affected European demographics and movement. Conflicts such as the Napoleonic Wars, the 30 Years' War, mobilized soldiers and their families across continental Europe and Russia. And added to this were internal migrations in response to famine, economic hardships, and changes in industry. What is perhaps most remarkable is that despite the significant immigration of many groups of peoples from Europe in the 19th and early 20th centuries, for migrants and minorities to belong, they had to assimilate to ways of life of the host or the hostile society. They had to naturalize. Likewise, the discourse around belonging pointed to the threat of those migrants and foreigners to national homogeneity. Even so-called non-nationals, like Jews, many of whom had resided in many of those countries for centuries, were deemed as unassimilable, inferior, and thus were positioned as social problems. It's within this context of the rise of nation states in modernity that the Jewish question, or what was referred to as a Jewish problem, became part of European debates and of Enlightenment concerns by both Jewish and non-Jewish thinkers and writers and politicians alike. While at first these questions arose alongside other national questions, it more specifically centered on Jewish legal, political, and economic disabilities as minorities in the 19th and 20th century. This continuation of ideas of belonging, exile, and return were used by proponents and opponents to political Zionism as one of the answers to that question. So in many ways, understanding how those discourses about Jewish exile and return, how they formulated in the decades before this is key to understanding the political aesthetic, the cultural responses, and the political responses to those problems and questions of Jewish belonging in the modern age, whether that was answers of migration, revolution, or return to a Jewish state in the land of Israel. There's also the facts of Jewish migration in the 20th century, which lend resonance to Jewish identities today. After a series of devastating pogroms in Europe, almost 3 million Jews left Eastern Europe between 1870 and the early 1920s. More than 2 million moved to the United States, among other countries of the West. The global scale of this migration is significant. It gave rise to Jewish communities like those in the UK that had significant impact on the cultures to which they came, and vice versa. It is within this story of inter and transnational movements that the story of Jewish exile and return today becomes a model of cultural exchange and integration. It's an important case study for the metropolization of minorities, the flight from these devastating pogroms and migration from Russia to major Jewish centers in the US, in Canada, Britain, Israel, Latin America, Australia, and South Africa, in particular, looms large in contemporary Jewish conceptualizations of identity. It fits into that story of exile and return to freedom. It's often how Jewish history is taught in schools and even in university programs. So I'll throw in some questions to consider between this idea of exile and return and Jewish migration as a reality. For one thing, recent scholarship in Jewish history has shown that although the pogroms were indeed an impetus for many, the reasons behind Jewish migration, as with other migrations, are always more complex in nature. They don't uncover some of the dilemmas, the individual choices, the directions of migration, which were not always very simple. In reality, there are many individual stories of people who came to the West for all sorts of reasons, economic, family, personal reasons. Likewise, there was return migration, although it was very relatively low, but not insignificant. The idea of persecution and anti-Semitism as impetus behind Jewish migration also highlights a central place of the role of anti-Semitism as a leitmotif or driving force in modern Jewish history. Salo Baron calls this a lachrymose conception of Jewish history, with tales and memories of anti-Jewish violence, flight, and refuge as dominant in popular and even scholarly renditions of the modern Jewish experience. The flight from the Nazis and the devastating impact of the Holocaust has also influenced how we see ideas of Jewish migration, and especially those earlier migrations. Because it goes without saying that individuals who were Jewish who did manage to flee Nazi-occupied Europe found refuge in the West. Home, therefore, becomes a complicated and painful memory. Seeking refuge in the post-war period also becomes a state or a condition of permanent transit. Caught between a painful past and an uncertain future, many Jews sought to recreate their lives in new locations, and yet the word refugee, which became synonymous with Jew in the early part of the 20th century, would haunt their everyday experiences. On the other hand, it also inspired thinkers and philosophers towards new ethical understandings of displacement and even the creative power of displacement. New metaphors have developed to depict that condition we call exile, raising questions about home, nation, belonging. So, what is the price of these ideas of Jewish exile, of the concept of Jewish exile, when thinking about Jewish migration as a reality? Does the view of Jewish history as a perpetual flight from persecution function too much as a prism for interpreting and retelling the past? On the one hand, it unites a potentially disparate number of Jews across a vast array of locations into a coherent community, but does a narrow Jewish experience to victimhood in a manner that also obscures the wide variety of Jewish subjective experiences, of attitudes and approaches to displacement, to memory, and to loss. Ultimately, does it ignore the cultural productions, the stories, the individual accomplishments, the hope and the faith, and the variety of developments of Jewish thought, culture, and practices that have identified what it means to be Jewish today. Thank you.
Well, Maya, thank you so much. It's such a wealth of material there. Thank you, perhaps deep down, for the insight into the experience of exile, I think, that you opened up for us there. So we get beyond the assumptions into that you could all, we were with you in the terms of the alienation from nature, from each other, from God, the questions of belonging and identity, the grappling with the ideal and yet the reality, and something again that is common across many cultures and faith groups, but particularly for the Jewish experience that was lived out. And the question for me at the end of it was, who owns the narrative of exile and migration? You know, who owns that? And you led us from, right at the end there, from that leitmotif in Jewish experience of the painful past and the uncertain future, to the creative potential of understanding it in fresh ways. Thank you so much. So we have just about 10 minutes of questions, and I wonder, we have a question. I think you can either put your hand up or we can go to the chats.